is looking at one of the three panels looking at the theme of areas beyond the South China Sea. And if you look in your program, the rationale for this panel is to look at the broader geopolitical arena of the Indo-Asia-Pacific region, to trace how issues and problems facing other maritime domains, particularly the East China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and two polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctic. And it is that latter space which we are going to be preoccupied with this morning under the theme of polar regions and new frontiers. And I'm pleased to say we've got a terrific panel of four experts who are going to speak to us on these themes. And to my far right, we have Professor Richard Herr from the Faculty of Law at the University of Tasmania in Australia. To my immediate right is Professor Anne-Marie Brady from the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, and also she's a Kissinger Institute on China in the United States fellow and representative of the Polar Institute. To my immediate left is Professor Timo Koivurova, the director of the Arctic Centre at the University of Lapland in Finland. And to my far right is Dr. Yongwook, who's an assistant professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School at the National University of Singapore. So we're delighted to have four excellent speakers. We have until 12:15. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes. I'll give them a reminder, a little nudge at 9 minutes, and we'll try and keep as much as possible to time so that we have plenty of time for questions and discussion to follow. So without any more from me, can I please ask Richard to present his first paper?
Thank you, David, and I'd also like to thank the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for the opportunity to be here. It's been a marvelous conference so far, celebrating 10 years of the South China Sea Conference, 25 years of UNCLOS, and for me at least this morning, 60 years of the Antarctic Treaty. I'm not a subject specialist in the South China Sea area, so I was very grateful to the Deputy Foreign Minister yesterday to keep me awake last night by giving me a new hook to hang my paper on. He said amongst his 5 points for finding a way forward that a political will would be necessary. Oh, thank you. That a political will was necessary, that international law should be the foundation for cooperation, and that we would need an appropriate mechanism for implementing cooperation. Now, my paper really basically says in 1959, we had these three elements come together to help create an opportunity to manage disputed sovereignty in Antarctica. And since then, it's been the Australian national position, at least, to preserve that agreement and to extend it into a robust, supportive regional system. As you'll see, my conclusion is that these things make it a less useful analog for what might be done for finding a solution in South China Sea, rather that it more in contrast than in similarities. You know that Antarctica is not like the South China Sea. Just a quick, to save time, the critical issue on there perhaps for you is that it holds 70% of the fresh water as ice. If it all melts, much of Vietnam will be underwater. And even as you saw yesterday in one of the presentations, that if what is scheduled to melt in the next 30 or so years, most of the Mekong Delta will be gone and a lot of Hanoi as well. So Antarctica is important in terms of what it means to this region, but not necessarily the Antarctic Treaty itself. Now, Australia's core interests in terms of policy are preserving our claim to 42% of the continent, strengthening the treaty that helps to preserve that claim, and three, securing leadership through the Antarctic system of treaties, the Antarctic Treaty system, that makes it all manageable. I'll skip over the next bit because David threatens me. This is the basis of the Australian claim and what it looks like, 42% of Antarctica. It came out of Australian expeditioners working under with British expeditions through discovery and exploration early in the 20th century. And in 1933, the British government decided to rationalize its interest in Antarctica and transferred those red sectors to Australia. Now, Australia's view at the time was that Antarctica was a gold mine of the future, and we actually tried to propose to the British government that they should give us the French territory that divides the two sectors there, and they should give up their interest in the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu. That would have been a historic change that I think would have resonated as some sort of folly had it been done. Now, the Antarctic Treaty basically has to be seen as a regional arrangement designed to prevent globalization of Antarctica. In 1948, the US proposed that Antarctica come under UN control and to be administered internationally. And over the next decade or so, there was a toing and froing of what to be done. And finally, 12 countries with very strong interest in Antarctica, 7 of them claimant states, the other 2, the Soviet Union and the US, with a basis for claim in Antarctica, agreed that this can't go on, we better solve it, and we better do it in a way that preserves our mutual interest. So they agreed to a treaty which had some key points. Military use would be prohibited, that the territorial claims would not be derogated or enhanced during the time of the treaty, and that the treaty has no terminal date. You'll note also, since this is before UNCLOS, basically the ocean areas, the marine areas weren't really dealt with. The key aspect of the treaty since '59 has, and this has been the Australian policy, has been to preserve the treaty by making it work in areas that would give rise to dispute if they weren't managed. The treaty itself is not a regulatory body, regulatory arrangement. So over the years, a variety of agreements that are detailed in my paper have been created which cluster around the treaty to give it some regulatory force and influence. But the point I would make, which is possibly relevant to the South China Sea issue in terms of regional solutions, is that the Antarctic Treaty very much depends, the treaty system rather, very much depends on global arrangements such as UNCLOS and the International Maritime Organization and so forth to give regulatory effect to decisions that are made within the Antarctic Treaty making decision processes. Secondly, Australia has tried to provide leadership in defending the treaty against challengers. By multilateral, both the United Nations in '48, Malaysia in '82, and then for those of you who understand cricket, the Pakistan rebel tour of Antarctica in 1991, which was deliberately outside the treaty system and meant to be provocative and led to a significant stoush between Australia and Pakistan, Australia taking the lead against this third-party intervention. And that was my third point, that because this is a regional treaty, the largest share of states in the world, not the largest share of states with influence, power, population, etc., but the largest number of states, nearly 140 of them, are not parties to the treaty. So the question is, what do you do with these third-party states? Do you give them the advantage of the treaty and risk the sort of thing that Pakistan tried to do? Or do you enforce it against third parties? And as a claimant state, that was particularly important to Australia. In our case, before the treaty, we passed a regulation to regulate the territory as if it were part of Australia under Australia's jurisdiction, and provided a legal framework for managing the continent, or our share of it. Controversially, in 2012, we added the offshore bits under the law of the sea with the extended maritime zones and continental shelf claims, under the argument that these were not new claims, but they were simply adjustments that were imposed by the change in the international law of the sea. And this is an argument that we had with some of the claimant states. I had a particularly vivid one with India at the time, because our argument was that if we didn't do this, it would actually have the effect of eroding our sovereign claims under Article 4. Well, the question is, has the Australian tactic of pursuing a regional solution for Antarctica to preserve its sovereignty and its claims worked? Well, the positive side of it is our claim isn't in active dispute. The size of our claim has actually worked to give us some leverage at the table of Antarctic affairs, and this leverage has allowed us to help set the important role in shaping the agenda of the future of Antarctica. Against that, you'll note that we preserved our claim by promising never to use it. And this has struck people as a kind of dog in the manger approach to sovereignty. We want it, but we'll never use it. Okay. And we do spend a lot more on our Antarctic program than we would if we didn't have that territorial claim. There's no doubt about that. However, on balance, as you can see, we continue to support the ATS as an effective regional arrangement because it helps to maintain our status, thank you, as a middle power and works in terms of the agenda for Antarctica. Are there any broader lessons for the South China Sea? Well, as I said, mostly I think the Antarctic Treaty System represents a contrast rather than useful analog. On the plus side, it does show, as the foreign minister said, that if you can find those 3 points, as we did in '59, you can find a solution. But I think the differences are clearly more important. It's unlikely that sovereignty would ever be taken off the table in the South China Sea. Resources in Antarctica still remain very speculative. Some people imagine them to be good, but all the commercial assessments say they're not going to happen in any reasonable time. And finally, just the picture of the ship there. That ship is stuck in the ice, elevated, completely out of water, with a mile of ocean underneath it. I'm on the front of it, waiting my turn to come down the ladder, and we can't go anywhere. Now, we cooperate in Antarctica through the treaty, but the practicalities of, as Admiral Koda said, the god of geography, you cannot cooperate on your own. Most expeditions are expeditions. They have to be self-contained because of the way this works, but the way the geography of Antarctica works. So cooperation is at more at a theoretical political level than at a practical implied level. I don't have time to talk about this one, but there was a case that I was involved in where the cooperation in the South China Sea ended up in the South Pacific, and the Australian response to that, that was my job, was to find a regional solution to take it out of the hands of the UN system and bring it into something that would be managed at a regional level. And finally, because I'm always asked, yes, there is a Tasmanian devil, and at that young age, they are cute and cuddly. They're not quite so when they grow up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thank you for keeping to time. That's an excellent start. And now, Professor Brady.
So it's a great privilege and a pleasure to be here. I have a PowerPoint that should be coming up in a minute. The organisers gave me an interesting task of speaking about the South China Sea, the South Pacific, and Antarctica. And I called my presentation, which you'll see in a minute, I hope, Connecting the Dots, because that's what I tried to do, is to connect the dots. And the dots that I see are the interests of the great powers in these 3 regions, and the security interests of the great powers in these regions of the world. And I'd add the Arctic into this. And I'm a China domestic and foreign policy specialist, so I'm going to bring you the China piece of the puzzle in this conversation. So there are other pieces to it, but I'm going to focus on China. I wrote a book that came out in 2017 called China as a Polar Great Power, and what I'm talking about today draws on some of the research there. So This map, by the way, is important to understand China's interests in those three regions that I was asked to speak about, the South Pacific, South China Sea and Antarctica. It's a vertical map of the world. Since 2014, it's been an official map of China. You might have, perhaps people who have saw the publicity about the peer map that appeared in 2014, and that's the first official map of China with the 9-dash line. So these maps go together. This map is is literal reorientation of the way you're used to seeing the world. And you see here the Mackinder idea of the world island, and the map is influenced by Mackinder's theories on geopolitics. You see the prominence of Antarctica like a white peacock, the Arctic Ocean as a middle ocean, the Zhongjianhai in Chinese is the word for the Mediterranean. And China is the heartland in this map, in this vision of the world, and that's actually the literal name for China, Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, the heartland. So in my research, I've been looking at some of the underpinnings for China's interests in the Arctic and Antarctic, which is part of the Haiang-Xitong, the maritime domain in China. And in the research that I did over the 10-year period when I wrote this book, I learned that 只有 Mahan is the big influence. And so people will be familiar with Mahanianism and its impact on Japanese thinking in the 20s and 30s. And similarly, Chinese scholars see the strength of Mahanian thinking for a rising power, and how they would look at what the imperatives for rising power in order to expand capacity and global influence. So these are the three categories of Mahan or four there. So another influence is Mackinder, as I mentioned, and here is Mackinder's map from his crucial book for trying to understand the role of geography and politics, and he talked about the heartland. And another factor in the thinking and the understanding of these connections between the three regions that I was asked to talk about is on the island chains and the Chinese response to the island chains and the security architecture that was established to defend that from the early 1950s. The hub and spoke defense pacts. We had US Republic of China, US Japan, US Korea, ANZUS, and even you can think of the Antarctic Treaty as the southernmost link of the hub and spoke defense pacts. And connected into that is also thinking about, we're going to go into grey zone, peaceful evolution, and from the Chinese perspective, what China's been getting at, targeted at China of political interference activities. So another influence on the connections between these regions is the fear of choke points. So let me, this is a map of Belt Road Initiative. There are two themes I want to talk about in my talk. One is to highlight of the interests that China has in these regions. As one is on Belt Road Initiative and the other is on Beidou. So China, like other great powers in history, is expanding beyond its borders, and the polar regions, the deep seabed, outer space are what the Chinese government announced in 2015 as part of China's new strategic frontiers. And so China is going global and looking to resources and opportunities globally, but also wanting to break through those choke points and constraints of the Malacca Strait dilemma. So Belt Road Initiative is a really important aspect of that. And you can see here, there is officially a ban on any complete map of the Belt Road Initiative connections. It would blow your mind if you saw them all connected in together. But going back to that map that I showed you of potential choke points, and Admiral Calder gave us an interesting map of choke points, you can see how Belt Road Initiative helps China to break through these choke points that they imagine, which is constraining and limiting China's security. And another influence and important strand of China's interest in these regions is Beidou 3, or Beidou. So that's global navigation systems. That's part of what's called C4ISR. So the United States set up a global system of GPS in 1995, and that's when they set up their GPS ground stations in Antarctica, and the whole world relies on GPS. So Russia and China cannot afford to rely on GPS because it's always been both a civil technology and a military technology. So this is why Russia and China are rolling out their own equivalents. For the Russians, it's GLONASS. For China, it's Beidou. And this is a great connector between those regions, because to be fully operational, a global navigation system must have Arctic and Antarctic ground stations, which Beidou now does. Of course, there's a Beidou ground station in Svalbard, and there are 3 ground stations in Antarctica, and then they need to go beyond that. And so similarly, Russia, of course, has ground stations for GLONASS in the Arctic and in Antarctic, and is getting very interested in the Pacific for the same reasons as China. And China's got some ground stations for Beidou in Laos, in Brazil, and in Pakistan. It has 3 in Australia, and it's looking for Pacific partners. And going back to the Belt Road Initiative, the signatories to the Belt Road Initiative, according to China's terms, are supposed to accept Beidou ground stations. And the numbers of signatories to the Belt Road Initiative are growing by the day. But signing or having an agreement on Belt Road Initiative and actually having Belt Road Initiative projects can be quite different. So sometimes there's a difference between what China wants and what China gets. So those are 2 important connections I want to highlight between China's interests in the South China Sea and the South Pacific and Antarctic and the Arctic. These are security interests, and they connect to China's rise as a global great power. And they are an example of how China's foreign policy is not just, when a country engaging with China has to understand their bilateral relationship with China, but also China's global interests. In order to understand your connection with China and the interests, and whether it's in your interest to expand that relationship, it's also necessary, I think, to understand issues like this and how they affect your own government and national interests. So thank you for listening to me. Hopefully I've kept to time. Didn't get any waves from David.
Thank you. You're even under. So, Professor Koivurova, you can actually have an extra minute if you'd like.
Right. Yeah, good morning, everyone. And kind thanks for the organizers for the invitation. So I will be looking at the Arctic Ocean as a new South China Sea. Might be a radical idea for you, but this has actually been suggested quite many times. Let me see if I can get this one. Yeah. So this has been actually suggested a few times already, and it raises difficult questions for the Arctic simply because we have all these challenges in the South China Sea, and the idea is that we will already have those in the Arctic Ocean, or we will have those in a foreseeable future. It's a very powerful comparison, but is it justified? That's what I'm going to be asking. And does this comparison in any way help us to understand what is happening in the Arctic? How is the governance of the Arctic evolving? Here you can see that the 2 regions as compared, and you can see also that the Arctic Ocean is much larger than the South China Sea. So there are 2 dimensions to this comparison. Is Arctic Ocean and the Arctic in general prone to conflict because of unclear ownership situation, as is the case in the South China Sea, talk about the islands and the maritime elevations, and we talk about the maritime entitlements. And second, is China going to behave in the Arctic Ocean the way it does in the South China Sea? That's also been raised, and I will come back to concrete examples of those. This is the first one. Scott Bergerson wrote in Foreign Affairs 2008, 2009, a couple of articles arguing, and I will quote, the rapid melt is also rekindling numerous interstate rivalries and attracting energy-hungry newcomers such as China to the region. The Arctic powers are fast approaching diplomatic gridlock, and that could eventually lead to the sort of ardent brinkmanship that plagues other territories, such as the desolate but resource-rich Spratly Islands, where multiple states claim sovereignty, but no clear picture of ownership exists. This was basically related to a time when there was a lot of awareness of the kind of rapidness of climate change in the Arctic. The region is warming 2 times as fast as compared to the rest of the world. It was also related to the kind of melting of the Arctic Ocean sea ice, which was then revealing plentiful hydrocarbons in the region, sea lanes to be used between the commercial centers, and also that there were government vessels going out to the sea, and media and international relations scholars were asking, okay, what is happening? Their kind of view of this was that something like this is happening, so that there is an unclear let's say sovereignty situation, and there are no rules in the region, and this was a full misunderstanding of the situation. So what was happening was that the states were sending their government vessels, research vessels to look into the kind of find the kind of scientific technical data for their submissions to the Commission on the Limits of Continental Shelf. And then Scott Bergerson himself, of course, also admitted this in 2013 in his Foreign Affairs Journal article again. What has also happened in the Arctic is that actually the governance of the Arctic has become much more ambitious. So the Arctic Council, the predominant intergovernmental forum of the Arctic, so consisting of 5 Nordic states, Russia, USA, Canada, has become much more ambitious. So it has started to catalyze intergovernmental legally binding agreements between the 8 Arctic states, Search and Rescue Agreement 2011, Oil Spill Agreement 2013, and Science Agreement 2017. Also outside of the Arctic Council, there have been kind of positive regulatory developments. So Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement was agreed in 2017, signed in 2018. Now it waits for ratifications and entry into force. Basically, it was developed by the Arctic Ocean coastal states, and then they invited China, Japan, South Korea, Iceland, and European Union as part of the negotiations. Also, the Arctic states were very much involved in making the Polar Code mandatory, legally binding, also providing kind of conditions for much safer and environmentally sounder shipping in the Arctic region. So clearly there are shared interests of the Arctic states, economic interests, sustainable development interest, and environmental protection interests. Most of the pollution to the Arctic comes from outside the region. And interesting was that even the very difficult time that we went through during the let's say the Ukraine controversy, the annexation of Crimea by Ukraine, and then the hostilities in eastern Ukraine, which then led to the sanctions regime on both sides. This didn't really have an impact on the Arctic, so that was a surprise also to myself. So as a conclusion, difficult to argue that the Arctic Ocean would somehow suffer from some kind of unclear sovereignty situation that there would be in South China Sea, or the lack of rules. So this is am I on time? Or?
You've got plenty of time.
Yeah, okay. So this is another way to exemplify the connection between the two regions. So this is speech delivered by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in my hometown Rovaniemi just one day before the foreign ministers meeting that ended the Finnish Arctic Council chairmanship. I was there on the spot, and it was pretty heavy talk, I have to say. So you can see from there in bold, I'm just reading this out loud. Do we want the Arctic Ocean to transform into a new South China Sea fraught with militarization and competing territorial claims? And you can see the pattern there is pretty much saying that whatever China is doing, wherever it can be transposed to the Arctic region. And what we found, we did a major, kind of fairly big study, you can find it online, about 10 researchers on China's policy and presence in the Arctic. So our conclusion was very different. So China behaves differently in different regions. Obviously it can adapt, also because it has to adapt. And if you think about the operational environment in the Arctic, it's totally different. So you have you have USA and China like big, major, powerful states, and also self-confident Arctic actors like Norway, Canada, of course also Russia. And clearly for China, South China Sea is of vast importance in terms of its national identity, and of course this is something that we have been discussing here, whereby the Arctic Ocean is not that important, I would argue. So no wonder that our study concluded that China has accepted the status quo in the governance of the region. So my conclusion, second one is clearly there is an error to argue that what China does in the South China Sea or elsewhere can be like that transposed to the Arctic Ocean. Then a few conclusions. So this comparison between the South China Sea and the Arctic Ocean brings about concern to Arctic debates because it does kind of allude to the possibility of problems, challenges in the Arctic governance. That's clear. But the facts so far speak to the contrary. There hasn't really been such problems or challenges. There are clear conditions in these two spaces that make them very different, as I have tried to demonstrate. Nonetheless, the ideas that are at the foundation of this comparison may influence the reality. And now I'm coming back to what Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, said in Rovaniemi, and also what President Trump also confirmed to our President Niinistö. So they do perceive China as a clear threat in the Arctic Ocean, and let's say that at the moment it is still much about the words, not so much about the action. Some diplomatic investments are there, but USA is obviously in a position that it can change the reality and it can influence the reality. So I think that this can come back to haunt us. At the moment we don't know, and of course much relates to whether Trump will be re-elected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're in unprecedented territory here, having 3 speakers in a row who are respecting the time limit. So no pressure on you, Dr. Ryu, but over to you.
All right, thank you very much for attending the session. I also want to thank the organizers for organizing this wonderful conference. It's my first time attending this conference, and I think it's been wonderful to attend some of the sessions so far. Let me throw out a caveat first. So I'm an expert of East Asian IR, and I'm only slowly developing my research interest in the Arctic, and I will do my best to provide what I think is the Chinese government's interest and behavior in the Arctic is, but it's always challenged to do so in front of so many experts. So it's going to be much of an education experience for you as well as for me. All right, so let me start. So I'm going to make two-legged argument. So I don't think the Arctic has the same dynamics as the South China Sea. And I do think that in the South China Sea, we should be concerned with the Chinese government's activities, especially the land reclamation activities and the militarization of the region, which goes against the institutional policy, sort of a foundation, existential policy of ASEAN, right? So ASEAN has always wanted to keep the region autonomous of great power intervention. They realized that that's no longer attainable, so that's when they changed their policy to invite all great powers in the region, right? So the relative bargaining power of each great power gets reduced since everybody gets involved, and that's going to make ASEAN a central player right, in determining the shape and contours of regional order in Southeast Asia, right? This is a policy known as enmeshment. Of course, the danger is that when great powers get involved, they could tear ASEAN apart. Now, I don't think that kind of dynamics exist in the Arctic. So my argument will be that first, Chinese interests in the Arctic are mainly commercial and trade and energy, not so much about military expansion or military domination. And the second part of to my argument is China's status as a non-Arctic state limits what China can claim and do in the Arctic, right? So China in the South China Sea is a sovereign claimant state. That status doesn't exist vis-a-vis the Arctic. So the Chinese interest, as well as China's status as a non-Arctic state, limit what China can claim and do in the Arctic, and therefore the dynamics in the Arctic are not going to be the same as those in the South China Sea. The Chinese interest in the Arctic certainly predates the BRI, right? So let me just give you this list of major policies, Chinese policies on the Arctic. So certainly it began in 1925 when China signed Multilateral Treaty, but it also established the Arctic and Antarctica Administration in 1981, and then goes on, right? So significant milestones is in 2013, China was admitted to the Arctic Council as a permanent observer, right, along with several other Asian countries. And all this, I mean, the reason that Asian countries all of a sudden became interested in the Arctic has a lot to do with climate warming, right? So climate warming led to the melting of the ice. It opened up new trading routes, which significantly reduces or potentially significantly reduces the travel time of shipping goods, as well as the melting of the ice opened up, right, the possibility of exploring energy sources, right? So hydro, petroleum, as well as the natural gas. And then there have been a number of recent Chinese policies, such as the 13th Five-Year Plan, which discusses the Arctic issue. And now we have the first Chinese special representative for Arctic affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? And then the Arctic policy has formally become part of China's BRI in 2018. So China's interest in the Arctic has significantly expanded in the recent years. So this is the simple map of how China wants to connect itself with the rest of the world, excluding the United States and to a large extent Western Europe and Japan, through oceans. And the upper line that you see is the Arctic, where the Arctic becomes significant. And this is another map showing what Chinese government is trying to do in the Arctic, and maybe build some ports, and then maybe connect these ports through rail to the Eastern Europe, so that the picture gets completed, right? So connecting China through the land channels as well as through the oceans. All right, so now let me move to the areas of China's interest. I'm going to discuss three main areas where of Chinese interest in the Arctic. As I said, I think the main and the dominating Chinese interest when it comes to Arctic is commercial and energy, right? And of course, the future, right, things could change, but at the present, I think this is true, that the Chinese government's main interest is exploring the possibility of new sea lanes right through the Arctic, and importing natural gas that the Russian government is trying to exploit. And I think the Russian government and the energy sectors can significantly reduce the cost of exploring natural gas, right? The liquefied natural gas, and as all of you know, that China has an environmental, right, and air pollution problem, and if natural gas price can come down significantly, then obviously that's going to be an attractive source of energy for China. So let me show you this, right? So this is an estimate of how much travel time could get reduced if these Asian nations travel through the Arctic, right? So for Shanghai and Hong Kong, the difference between traveling through the Suez Canal versus traveling through the Northeast Passage, the reduction for Shanghai is about 25%, right? In distance. For Hong Kong, it's 11%. Right? For Japan and South Korea, it also is a significant reduction of travel time and distance. The second interest, right, for China has to do with scientific, and I think here many Asian nations, including China, perceive their scientific activities, right, in the Arctic or relating to Arctic as a way to increase their voice in the Arctic Council, right? So this is what the Chinese government wants to do. There are at least 13 Chinese universities that are taking part in Arctic research now as part of U-Arctic NORDA-NET, and Chinese government has also engaged in Arctic expeditions, and there's a significant amount of scientific research conducted by Chinese scholars. So this graph done by one of my students represents the number of academic and media articles produced by Chinese scholars, right, in the Chinese language since the early 1990s. And you know, the graph is fairly self-explanatory. There's a steady increase in the amount of research and media coverage produced in China on the Arctic. Actually, it's not 3 areas, it's actually 4 areas of China's interest. The third area is multilateral diplomacy. And I do think that this one represents probably the most significant distinction in Chinese foreign policy in the Arctic as opposed to in the South China Sea. So China conducts its Arctic diplomacy within the Arctic Council, and China wants to conduct its diplomacy within the Arctic Council, right? So China has not challenged the legitimacy of the Arctic Council, and it wants to respect international law, presumably including UNCLOS, right? And it views Arctic as a common good for the humankind, right? So that's how the Chinese government treats the Arctic. And here, I think the Chinese position in terms of international law stance is closer to the United States, right? So even though Mike Pompeo was deeply concerned with Chinese activities in the Arctic and making analogy with South China Sea, China wants to treat the Arctic as a common good for the humankind, right? And treats the sea lanes as international passages, whereas Canada and Russia tend to view those areas as part of their internal waters. And so this is, at least there's a potential that when it comes to legal positions, China and United States could cooperate. And there's an area where China and Russia could diverge quite significantly because Russia claims sovereignty over the sea lanes and the waters, whereas China does not agree with that position. Let's see. Yep, I've mentioned China's status, right, as an permanent observer in the Arctic Council. There's a special representative for the Arctic Affairs, Gao Feng, and he acts as the senior Arctic official for China to the Council to enhance China's contribution to the Council. And then there's the Sustainable Development Working Groups of the Arctic Council, where China took part in a conference in 2016. And then there were some workshops organized by indigenous groups. And I think the Chinese government permitted China's indigenous groups to participate and organize those working groups or meetings within the Arctic Council. So overall, Chinese diplomacy in the Arctic takes in the Arctic Council in a multilateral setting. One thing that I want to add is the Arctic Council does not have the mandate to discuss and debate political and security issues, right? So the main focus of the Arctic Council is scientific, right, environmental sustainability, economic, and so on and so forth, but not security and politics. And if things develop for the worse, so if Russia expands its military activities in the Arctic and other concerned parties in response to that increase their military activities in the Arctic, then we don't really have an appropriate, at the moment, multilateral forum to discuss those issues. The final one is security. And it's true that China has a security interest in the Arctic. Professor Anne-Marie Brady talked quite a bit about sort of China's global vision or strategy and how Chinese policy towards different oceans are designed to serve China's global strategy. I do think that, I think she's absolutely right, but also I do think that at present, China's main security interest in the Arctic is to preserve its commercial interest, right? So, and obviously this is the right of every sovereign nation state to do this. China does not, and in my opinion, cannot dominate the Arctic, whereas one could infer Chinese intentions in the South China Sea as being dominating, right, and driving the U.S. out of it. And as far as I can discern, that even the very latest Code of Conduct negotiations between ASEAN and China, the Chinese officials would like to keep the South China Sea as an issue between China and the concerned parties in ASEAN, not getting external powers involved, right, such as the United States and Japan. So there one can infer the Chinese intention and goal to be where this is part of our area of sphere of influence. I don't think China can do that. The same thing towards the Arctic. So the main interest, security interest of the Chinese government in the Arctic is to protect its commercial interests and preserve its right to explore and use the Arctic, right, for open sea lanes and energy interests. All right. So in conclusions, let me make the following points. So China's interest in the Arctic is multidimensional and has grown significantly. And nowadays, wherever China goes and whatever China does, right, there's almost automatic generation of concern and criticism. And of course, we should be concerned with Chinese activities in the Arctic, but I do not think that one cannot draw the same kind of parallel in the Arctic as we do in the South China Sea. China's interest in the Arctic is mainly commercial and energy related, and its security interest is mainly to protect its commercial and energy related interests, and its diplomacy takes place in a multilateral setting of the Arctic Council. As I said, China's influence in the Arctic and its activities will be limited because of its status as a non-Arctic state. And so that's a big difference from the South China Sea. All right, so, one more thing. So I also know that there's been some concern regarding potential Sino-Russian military or security cooperation in the Arctic, right? I mean, it's been the case that in the East China Sea, in South China Sea, these two countries have engaged in joint military and naval exercises. So there is a concern that perhaps Russia and China will do the same thing in the Arctic. I don't think that's likely, mainly because these two countries do not see each other eye to eye, and their interests in the Arctic are are different, if not diverging. And if you look at the one issue where Russia can have some leverage over China, it's actually the Arctic. Right? So I don't think the Russian government is going to let go of that leverage so easily. So I mean, once again, one should be concerned, but I think we should not be overly concerned and draw the wrong kind of analogy or parallels right between the Arctic and the South China Sea. All right, so let me stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to getting your comments, questions, and criticisms. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think you agree we've had 4 really excellent and concise presentations that have noted some of the similarities and parallels between the regions under discussion in the South China Sea, but have also identified some pretty clear differences. We have about half an hour for Q&A, maybe a little bit less. And so I'd open the floor now for questions, whether or not you've got a question about the Arctic, the Antarctic, or also Professor Brady also spoke a little bit about the Pacific, and so that might be a question. So floor's open. Please, and if you could perhaps just introduce yourself very briefly.
Diplomacy Center. I think some of you know of Dr. Berkman's work. And I appreciate the information that we received this morning from all of the panelists. I want to come back to this, Dr. Ryu brought up the multilateral diplomacy efforts, and of course, in your final remarks, you said that we don't have to be concerned about bilateral cooperation between Sino-Russian interest, if you wish. But on the level of what I call science cooperation or science diplomacy, are we seeing any signs, and this is really an open question for all the panelists, any signs of that science cooperation that's taking place that I want to separate from the security cooperation, if we can do that, and welcome your comments as they unfold here. Thank you.
To clarify, that's on Sino-Russian science cooperation specifically. Yes. Okay. Should we put that to the panel? It was to you directly, but others might want to pick up on that.
So here, I shouldn't pretend that I actually know right about and can answer your question. So I think I should leave it to the other panelists to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. And you know, you possibly know the 2017 science agreement. So that was really meant to mostly kind of enhance the scientific cooperation between the Arctic states, but also the non-Arctic states are to some extent involved. I think that China is conducting science. That's perhaps where I would be kind of a little bit hesitant. What's the actual driving force at the moment? I mean, obviously there are selective kind of economic investments in different parts of the Arctic, but they are not overly great from the part of China. And I'd guess that what China has been really putting a lot of money is science, and that goes to Russia, but to you know the marine areas and you know bilaterally with many Arctic countries. So that's something that their kind of investments in science in the Arctic have been kind of really monumental, I would say.
So Russia, or the Soviet Union as it then was helping China to develop polar skills from the 1950s. And so there is a strong partnership, a long-standing partnership between Russia and China and scientific cooperation, but it's politically directed. And there is a difference between the individual relationships between scientists, which can be very amicable and where they can find points of agreement, and then the policies and intentions of their governments, which can be completely different. And that's very much the case in Antarctica. We see that individual researchers have great relationships and have common views on things, for example, such as environmental issues, but there is an official playbook that, at least in some countries, that you have to work within. That's very much the case with China. So China and Russia have significant partnerships, scientific partnerships in the Arctic, but not in the Antarctic, which is interesting because they have diverging interests in the Antarctic. And in the Arctic, we are finding that there is convergence of China's, Russia's appreciation and tacit support for China's security interests in the Arctic. Because there's something that Dr. Rio missed out about China's security interests in the region, and it's the second strike nuclear deterrent. So this is the holy grail for China. They've been trying since 1959 when the USS Skate emerged in the Arctic, and Mao Zedong saw the potential of a nuclear-armed submarine lurking beneath the ice and asked Khrushchev to help China to develop submarines with nuclear weapons, and Khrushchev said, don't worry, we've got those, you don't need them. And then China began on the journey of creating their own submarine program, and it was very rudimentarily initially, and they bought some redundant technology from the French in the early 80s when Xi Jinping was the Secretary to the Minister of Defense. Redundant because it was too noisy under the Arctic ice. That was the specific reason why Gungbiao was told off for buying these very expensive French submarines. So that is, there's just in May this year, there's been a new development from, indications from Russia where there might be convergence and acceptance of China's interests, security interests in the Arctic. Because if China was to get a submarine into the Arctic, obviously, going back to what Admiral Koda was saying about choke points, they've got to get through some quite significant choke points to be able to get up there. And so if Russia was to say, help yourself, it could make all the difference. So this is the big question, really. Is the Chinese submarine program going to be so good that they can sneak through the choke points? Or is Russia going to let them get up into the Arctic basin? So the scientists there can have their cooperation and their nice drinks of Maltai and vodka together, but that's different again from what the governments want.
Thank you. Not much to add other than in the Antarctic. What we have found is a mutual support in terms of resource development in Antarctica. Both China and Russia work together to prevent a marine protected area and continue to veto this together. And that's a source of concern, obviously, from the Australian point of view, because we've been taking the leadership role in trying to promote environmental protection and sustainable development of the fisheries in the Antarctic region. And so the fact that the two cooperate in a political agenda, as Anne-Marie says, the scientists get on very well. There's not too much of an issue. Of course, we know with the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union lied repeatedly about its exploitation of whales, fish, and others in the Antarctic. And this has created a degree of suspicion about the sort of science they produce. And that is, again, it's one of those issues that tends to be glossed over, but if it's going to be used by these two countries together to frustrate cooperation in Antarctica, it will lead to at least tensions at a political level.
I'd just like to add to that I'm not sure that Russia and China are cooperating when it comes to the opposing the marine protected areas in Antarctica. They have different reasons why they oppose it, different interests there. Russia just wants to fish anywhere or have the rights to potentially, and China has differing views about interpreting Antarctic agreements and so on. But effectively, they are a bloc. And in the Ross Sea MPA, China didn't, you only need one country to disagree. So Russia was the one that was getting the opprobrium in the final terms.
Yeah. But indeed, it still comes back to making the Camelot fishing agreement work, and that's where they have been working together to create difficulties that, as I say, based on previous experience, perhaps less with China, but more with the Soviet Union, where we simply didn't trust the science they provided. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't know enough about Sino-Russian scientific cooperation, but let me just share one thing that concerns a lot of countries, which is the nuclear-powered submarine, right? Activities by the Chinese government. And of course, scientific research serves multiple purposes, right? So it can serve scientific research, environmental research, but also it can be useful for military purposes. And the Japanese government is quite concerned, right, with this nuclear-powered submarine activities by the Chinese, because Japan does not have a nuclear-powered submarine, right? So when the Chinese submarines go around and gather information and intelligence, the concern there is maybe this sort of knowledge and research gained by the Chinese government can be used to break out of choke point, right? So of course there's the territorial disputes between Japan and China, and that's a big concern for the Japanese government. But if Chinese submarines travel along the Japanese coastlines to sail through the Arctic, obviously, right? That's going to be a concern for Japan. All right.
Another question. I wonder if I can just follow up maybe on that, if there's not one.
As a kind of the established, or the de facto, the thing. China could selectively employ or imply its domestic law to some nations. So, for example, China didn't like Japan. Say China may imply their domestic law over Japanese shipping there, and say your ship is out of the security or safety standard from the Chinese. So your ship cannot pass through the South China Sea. So Japan is the alternative between the Indonesia and Australia, or south of the Australia. So that's one thing Japan is taking seriously into the consideration. But say, for example, if the bunch of Japanese shipping or other nation shipping steam through the south of the ocean and Australia, what could be the position of the Australia? That would raise another friction. This could be cyber warfare from some country. And similar, the Arctic Ocean is not so fancy, especially the weather. Even the de-icing happens. I was the first Western admiral who visited the Petropavlovsk in year 2000, because when they opened the port, Russians did not want to invite Americans, so I went there first. And my experience, any time after the end of September, the Sea of the Bering will be a kind of the human killing, the waters. So in theory, say, the distance between Asia, Japan, China, South Korea to Europe will be reduced by 30%. There will be a serious and the natural enemy. That's we call the graveyards of the depression. So that does not necessarily guarantee the merit. That armchair theory we expect. But at the same time, say we have the similar dilemma. Not only the Chinese nuclear submarine, but even in summertime only, maybe another attack. But from say April to the September period, Chinese shipping started steam through the Sea of Japan to the Lapland Strait and Sea of Okhotsk. Maybe our rough estimate will be the number of shipping will be increased by 30%. Okay, thank you. This is how to prevent the unknown cyber attacks. So Japan will face the similar problems like the Australia. Safety of shipping, and if China thinks it's dangerous, they may send the warships to our areas. And also the security of the choke points. So the de-icing of the Arctic really provides there's some kind of unexpected serious problem to Japan. And also, I don't want to be long, but Japan has two mixed views over Sino-Russian relationship. Russia in Far East, Russia surrendered to China by economy. Their size of the GDP is the equal as the South Korea. And they maintain the world's largest nuclear power and pretty robust military powers. So for Russia to really develop the Far East and the Kuril Islands, they need the Chinese money. So that's one observation. But at the same time, what's the treasure of the Russia for survive? That's the natural resources on the Siberia and the Arctic, the seabed of the Arctic Ocean. Yeah, and so based on our observation, in that area, Russia surrendered that to China, but at the same time, Russia does want to protect those treasures from Chinese. And think about the population. This is my last part. 6 million to the north and 400 million to the south. How to protect? So are there any Chinese? Yes, okay. But, this is a kind of the drinking talks. But some Russian retired officer, we discussed, only way for Russia to protect its border is the use of nuclear. This is the kind of drinking conversation. But the Sino-Russian border would be the second place where the nuclear arms will be used after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's one thing you need to understand. Yep.
Thank you very much for that. Richard, did you want to respond?
Yes, if I could. Just an observation, Admiral Koda. I wasn't sure if I understood you correctly, but there is an important difference between the ice in the Arctic and the ice in the Antarctic. But that's going to change. For people who are unaware of it, the Arctic ice is usually multi-year ice, and that tends to be harder than steel, and it slices through steel hulls, well, like a knife, through butter sometimes. The Antarctic ice is just annual ice. It freezes out for 200 miles in the winter, and then it melts away in the summer. So it's fragile, it breaks up, it's not an impediment to shipping. And that's been part of the difficulty with shipping in the Arctic. But once the multi-year ice, which is diminishing year by year, that passage through the Arctic becomes far more practical in a commercial way, and it won't be the kind of geographic that you suggested perhaps that it is at the moment.
Yeah, but only for a couple of months of the year. So you've got the ice-breaking fees as well, which are about 300,000 from the Russians, which everyone has to pay, about 300,000 US per transit. So those charts about it being a shorter route are very theoretical. And China has actually made a relatively small number of transits for, not within the Arctic, there is quite a bit of shipping from, say, Murmansk to Shanghai, but actually the kind of routes that have been talked about where, Shanghai to Paris would be a lot faster, that sort of thing, is actually uncommon. It's not commercially viable for China to conduct the shipping there for the ice-breaking fees because of the limitations of the small window each year when the Arctic ice is sufficiently melted, and also because China's major markets, the ports in which the goods go to, don't match up with that route. So it's much more of a political move. It's part of China having the right to speak. The Huayuquan, a multi-level engagement in the Arctic, because China was really excluded from involvement in Arctic governments for a number of years. They're not a permanent observer. That's really important to distinguish what they are. They're an ongoing observer. Russia objected to China being a permanent observer to the Arctic Council, and the impasse was broken by the US in 2009 by changing the terminology, which the Russians would accept. that they're an ongoing participant. They don't have to apply every year, but they're not called a permanent observer. So the Russians are very huffy about who has a say in Arctic governance, as are the 5 Arctic littoral states. I think it is really important to look at the actions, not just the words of what's going on in the Arctic, and to count the number of voyages versus the number of speeches that are made, and academic papers and newspaper articles that are written about the topic of China's shipping interests in the Arctic.
Yeah, I was about to also comment on Dr. Ruus, is it properly pronounced, comments on the kind of transit possibilities that we are foreseeing in the Northern Sea route. Obviously, we know that Northwestern Sea route is kind of off limits because Canada has taken totally different take on that. It's not developing it as a commercial sea route, so we know that the situation is not developing as many commercial operators would want it to develop. So there are lots of calls from icebreakers, etc. Very short season, and of course when the sea ice disappears, it makes the ocean more volatile. So it has also had a very kind of stabilizing effect. But also there are very shallow straits in the Northern Sea route. So all of those things really have meant that the transit passage has not been really moved anywhere. It's more about destinational shipping, going to Russia and get natural resources and come back to the commercial centers, but also offshore hydrocarbon resources. So this is something that we tend to have this idea that, there is plenty of opportunities in the offshore Arctic, and now Trump seems to have those ideas, obviously. So this is very difficult to make commercially viable, and there have been like a 30-year effort to make that offshore oil and gas commercially viable. It can happen in the kind of ice. Those maritime areas where there is no ice, like in the Norwegian Barents Sea. But then when you go to the ice-infested regions, it's extremely difficult to make commercially viable. So those are just to kind of highlight that it's not a. We tend to kind of project very easily, many of the kind of new world ideas to the Arctic, and it will take some time. And when we are there, I'm afraid that climate change has already gone to the extent that we are not thinking about the Arctic. We are thinking about the world at large.
Let me just say a few words about Japan, because I think Japan is really fascinating when it comes to this Arctic issue. So in a most idealistic world, if the new sea lanes open up through the Arctic, of course there are challenges to that, then Japan gets an alternative, channel through which to import energy, maybe cheaper natural gas and trading route, in addition to the South China Sea. So, and all of a sudden Japan becomes a strategic location that can connect these two potentially major trading routes, So it becomes a strategic location. That's an ideal, most ideal world. The worst situation for Japan is if South China Sea gets dominated by China, and if the Arctic gets dominated by Russia, and if these two countries come together to cooperate. Of course there are legal issues where these two countries do not see eye to eye in the Arctic, but maybe these two countries will just scrap the international law and just push through their wills, using power in these two areas. Then all of a sudden what used to be a choke point for China becomes choke point for Japan, So and that's a big concern. And obviously the latter part is about security. The first part is about commercial and energy. So it's interesting to that extent. The Japanese government has to worry about this the worst scenario that could occur, but at the same time wants to explore these new opportunities that could emerge through the melting of the ice.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, please.
Rob Rebell from the Centre of Strategic Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. The panel, for the most part, tended to focus on contrasts between the polar regions and the situation in the South China Sea, rather than parallels, and there was a very strong emphasis on China's role in the polar regions. I wonder if any of the panelists could comment on whether there are any implications for ASEAN states from the experience of international arrangements in the polar regions and from the trajectories that we see developing in the polar regions. Is there anything that the ASEAN states can draw on in addressing the South China Sea issue from those experiences, or is it really a matter of complete contrast?
Thank you very much, Rob. I might take, if there's another question, I might take that at the same time and put it to the panel. This might be your last opportunity. If anybody has another one? Okay, otherwise that's a great question. And start with Anne-Marie, and if you want to make some concluding comments as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so, I mean, I did talk about the connections, actually. That was connecting the dots, is what I was saying in my talk, is that there are real connections between the regions. And I said that they were for other great powers, not just for China, but I'm a China scholar, so I contributed on the China aspects in great detail. But I've also written on Russia's interests in the Antarctic and been paying close attention to their interests, in the growing interests in the South Pacific, and also more historical ones. But for ASEAN, and what they could learn from how things are changing in Arctic governance and the sort of more slow changes in Antarctic governance, but sort of ongoing problems that I called it the emerging politics of Antarctica, actually, in a book of a couple of years ago, is as I said before, you've got to understand your individual relationship with China, your bilateral relationship, your trading and other kind of connections. But then where do you fit in within China's global agenda? So there's a couple of ASEAN powers, ASEAN states who have got those Beidou ground stations. So Brunei and Laos and Thailand have Beidou ground stations, and in South Asia, Pakistan. And then the Belt Road Initiative as well, seeing the strategic dimensions to it, not just the economic ones. So it requires, I think, an expansion, upskilling of everybody's skill set to incorporate the ASEAN knowledge. Because China has growing international interests, there is, and there's been, I think there's a lack of human resources and knowledge of China's domestic and foreign policy, and real lack of Chinese language skills amongst analysts, but everyone's got a whole lot of other set of skills, that there's a need to expand the skill set, to incorporate that depth of knowledge on ASEAN, for example, and where does China fit in to the various dilemmas that ASEAN's grappling with. So I think that, and that's the same for the Arctic and Antarctic too, is that when we consider what's going on in the Arctic, you have to you have to look at the Chinese language sources to know what China's agenda is in the Arctic, because as elsewhere, there's a two-level discourse. There's the discourse that foreigners are meant to hear, and then the ones they're not. And you need to be paying attention to both, what you're supposed to hear and what is not meant for your ears, but which you really need to know about. And this is part of, the Soviets had this too, it's sort of the traditional non-transparent approach to foreign policy, which can make it difficult to understand China's intentions. And that is, again, that's a connection that you can find in terms of China's policy in the South China Sea, the South Pacific, and Antarctica and the Arctic. So that's another connection I would draw. A lesson that can be learnt is the need to invest in the Chinese language skills and incorporate that, what you're not supposed to know, in terms of understanding what's going on about what China wants to deal, how they want to deal with you. Thank you.
Add much, Rob. I think that from the ASEAN point of view, if it was a coherent regional structure that didn't confront China as in a confrontational way, but were able to match it with some level of equality, that would help. But that actually comes more from my South Pacific work than from my Antarctic work. I don't see that the Antarctic really has much to offer ASEAN other than the value of regional arrangements for dealing with common problems where you can.
Yeah, thanks. A very difficult question, and obviously my presentation was premised on the idea of vast differences between the South China Sea and the Arctic Ocean. To some extent, I mean, Arctic Council is a celebrated intergovernmental forum simply because it's a forum. It's not an organization. And obviously, like, it has been able to with this kind of science-based kind of a cooperation, it has been able to advance environmental protection and sustainable development in the region. Perhaps the problem in my mind is really that the kind of geopolitical kind of, let's say, underlay of the region is so different that when you have a kind of South China Sea and the kind of ASEAN region where there is one dominant power, regional power, it's very difficult to kind of have this kind of comparison. But I guess that one thing that I threw in my presentation was also that the Trump administration is now trying to clearly confront China in all fronts, also in the Arctic, and that's something that has surprised us, quite frankly so. So that's something that is to some extent similar, so, but nothing else comes to mind. Thanks.
Great question. I don't think I have an answer to that. I mean, of course, everybody wishes there had been similar forum in Southeast Asia, right? As long-standing as the Arctic Council. Of course, there are differences, right? So China completely dominates Southeast Asia. Russia cannot dominate, right, the Arctic to the same extent. One thing that I think ASEAN countries can do is, I'm certain they can complain, but that's not going to do much good for them, right? So rather than doing that, they should try to get their acts together, right? And that's something that they could do, right? So the whole notion of ASEAN centrality is based on ASEAN cohesion, right? So doing things together, coming up with a united voice, right, in foreign relations. And if you read the ASEAN Charter, it actually requires ASEAN member states to give priority in their external relations to ASEAN. But how many of ASEAN countries actually do that, right? I mean, Cambodia is, more or less is on the side of China when it comes to South China Sea. Myanmar doesn't seem to have much interest in ASEAN, so it goes, right, and kicks out part of its population, and the rest of ASEAN is more or less silent, right, on that particular Rohingya crisis. So I do think that ASEAN must get its acts together if it wants to even create, some sort of forum or organization similar to the Arctic Council where it can bind China as part of this institutional network and international norms, so that China at least, right, tries to behave, right, according to international rules and standards. Of course, that's going to be very, very difficult for anybody to achieve. One sort of, since you asked me to have a concluding remark, I do share concerns and pessimism about Chinese behavior, right, especially when it comes to military and security activities. But also at the same time, one should not infer too much, right, into the Chinese actions and behavior. I do think that what the Chinese government is trying to do when it comes to, for projects such as BRI, does provide the potential for public goods, right? And this is a position of many ASEAN countries. So there's no country in the world, maybe save for the United States, but USA doesn't really have much interest in doing it, that can put out as much money as the Chinese government is doing, right, through the BRI projects. And Asian countries, most of whom are developing nations, do need investment, right, in order to develop. And this is a good story. Of course, there's a concern about potential political influence, right, reduced policy autonomy and security activities by the Chinese government. I think the focus should be not on sort of generating sort of bad reputation and bad criticism of the Chinese government, but trying to find ways to nudge Chinese policy and behavior in the right manner. And of course, you cannot dictate the Chinese foreign policy, but at least other countries can cooperate, right, and set the standards, right? So, one thing that I tell other countries in ASEAN and Japan and the United States and South Korea is at least they can get together, right, and cooperate on certain infrastructure projects and set a good example for the Chinese government to follow, right? So this competition can be not so much for zero-sum, like this security competition, but it can be a competition for the provision of public goods. And if Japan, USA, if wins, then the Chinese government would like to compete in that area, right? And we will try to improve its standards. So I think that's the perspective and the way that we should go.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, I think we all agree we've had 4 great presentations, a range of really good questions from the floor. We've gone from one end of the world to the other and traversed lots of issues in between. But it's been a really stimulating panel, and I'd now like you to join me, please, in thanking our 4 speakers.